Thank you everyone for joining us. I see you all are coming into our conversation. As you all are coming in, I would love to see where you're coming in and tuning in from. Please make sure to put that into the chat feature if you like, as I go over some housekeeping items. If this is your first time joining our IC Talks, the international community of the Society of Professional Journalists, we're a community of journalists that encourage press freedom globally. Our aim with our talk series really is to connect journalists at a time when it's really difficult to do so in person. So with these one-on-one conversations, we're really aiming to dig a little deeper and create that opportunity for you guys to have direct access to our guests. So we hope you learn, grow, and take away from today information that's going to help you and inspire you in your work going forward. The format's really simple. The guests and I are going to have a conversation. So we have the chat and Q&A feature open. The Q&A portion will be for you guys, the attendees, to ask questions for our guest. Once we have your question, we will unmute you and you can ask them directly. If you prefer that I ask for you, please make sure to make a note of that, and I'm more than happy to do that for you. Please make sure the chat feature, you use that for any technical questions or concerns. My co-chair, Dan Kubisky, he's going to keep an eye on that for us. So our guest today, Mosheh Oinounou, former executive producer of CBS Evening News, the man behind the launch of the 24-hour news at CBSN. Before his work at CBS, he worked at Bloomberg TV, where he led the on-the-ground coverage. And during his career, he has produced interviews with 5 American presidents and more than 24 world leaders, which we're really glad to have you with us today.
It's great to be with you guys.
You know, we've had journalists in the past conversations, and I think your perspective as an executive producer is really going to give our community some insight into what consideration is being taken into planning and curating news and broadcast. And because essentially, whatever makes the cut and what the public sees is in your hands. Am I correct?
Well, it's a team effort. It's a team production. It takes the team on the ground and back at headquarters putting those stories together. So it's in all of our hands, the collective team. You
know, the one thing I like to do with someone like yourself, especially since you have such a wonderful career from the past, I want to say, was it almost 18, 20 years or so? What made you interested to pursue journalism in the first place? How were you able to get that first opportunity in the field of journalism?
Well, it starts very young. My father likes to tell a story about how he used to give me money as a first grader for ice cream, and I chose to come back with the Chicago Tribune growing up outside Chicago. So clearly it started very young. I was very fortunate to go to a high school that had a media program and then ended up at GW in Washington, D.C. I guess there's never quite a boring time in Washington, but I got there just in time for the Gore-Bush election and Supreme Court fight my freshman year. Sophomore year, I'm there 2 weeks, and suddenly 9/11 happens the first day of my internship on Capitol Hill. And then obviously the war on terrorism and Iraq, et cetera. So it gave me an incredible story to be able to tell, both as a campus reporter, eventually becoming an editor of the college newspaper there, and then was fortunate to have a couple internships with national news organizations, ABC News and then Fox News Channel with Chris Wallace, that led me to kind of have a head start in Washington, D.C. with a national organization, and then went from there.
You know, I always talk about with students the importance of building mentorships. Is that something that was really important for you when you first started out, having a mentor and building that relationship?
Absolutely. I think that, that's something that I like to tell young folks starting out too. It's all about those relationships, especially at a time like today, where we've seen more than 11,000 journalists lose their jobs in the last 6 months due to the economy and some of the underlying trends that were happening. And any job that opens up is going to have a lot of applicants. And so ultimately, any relationships that you build within the industry are going to be crucial. As you start out, having those mentors, whether they're professors, advisors, folks you seek out that you like their work and you can reach out to them via Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, those relationships are going to be crucial as those people might be able to help you out within their organizations or advise you on where there might be opportunities. And so keeping up those relationships, if you're lucky enough to get those internships, maintaining a dialogue with those folks who you may have worked for, but also, again, people you might respect out there in the industry. The first one might not be responsive, the second one might not be, but journalists like to hear about their work, like feedback. And so, and frankly, the ones that I've worked with like to help out the next generation of folks. So that's key.
We did have a question from someone in our community asking about what are some tips that you would give journalists that are starting out that don't have the opportunity to be in a newsroom to build those relationships with mentors, especially now things are not in person anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is even if you're not in an official newsroom at an organization, the nature of social media and digital these days is that everybody has their own platform. And so ultimately, whether it's your Twitter account, your Instagram account, things that you're shooting, interviewing on your own, I mean, we all witnessed Instagram suddenly in March and April, anytime I log in, there's 5 people doing live IG lives, right? And so you have a platform to do your own show, to conduct your own interviews. And so that's the first thing I would tell you is like, don't be frustrated. Don't feel like if I don't have a organization under my name that suddenly I can't do anything. No, you can. In fact, you could make I think that there's a lot of journalists out there who made their name individually, caught the attention of major organizations who said, they're doing something special over there. We need them here. We're going to create a job for them. So that would be significant. You also find yourself in a time, given the pandemic, given the lack of travel, that where you are matters. And so if you happen to be in a place domestically, internationally, where something is going on, you can become your own broadcaster with your phone, or your own reporter, again, with your phone or social media, etc. So Black Lives Matter is a great example. We saw protests light up in 100 American cities. Well, it was probably happening within a few miles of where you were. And there's a story to be told there that clearly the national media had, and even frankly local media, had not gotten a great gauge on the anger that was really out there. And so talk to those people and tell that story, because frankly, it clearly wasn't being effectively written about in advance.
Right. I look at your career when you did you were basically in a 24/7 news cycle for the last portion of this when you were at CBS News. What makes a journalist really successful in that environment from what you know? And what are some obstacles in that landscape that maybe those of us that are not familiar would benefit from knowing about?
Well, I think that it depends on how you're coming in and what your role is. I would say I started on 24/7 News at Fox News Channel, almost 15, 16 years ago. So I've lived that, like I like to say when we hire folks, it's not a job, it's a lifestyle. And ultimately, the people who really tend to thrive are the ones that are able to constantly pivot. We were joking earlier about the fact that, in 2020 alone, as a journalist for a national news organization in the US, you may have had to become a climate expert. You had to become a constitutional scholar in regards to impeachment. You had to become an epidemiologist of sorts. You had to become the constitutional stuff will come in handy, it sounds like, as the election is happening. Vote counting expert, vaccine creation specialist, understanding the various phases of a vaccine. So having that ability to kind of pivot on every story, drop what you were doing, pick up the next thing, I think tends to distinguish the folks who tend to do really well. Also know that especially if you're an organization that has an online outlet, even if that is not your specific job, typically as a manager, you give as long as the folks who are the producers and reporters are doing their job on a daily basis or doing whatever they're assigned to do, your free time is yours. And so you have an outlet, you have a platform at the organization you work at. So to the extent that you can utilize that and utilize time in between to be able to report out passion projects or try new things or experiment, is certainly something I would suggest.
So, touching on this, it seems it's almost as if you're innovative and almost entrepreneurial, you'll be successful in this phase that we're in right now with the pandemic as a journalist. In your experience before, when you were building out CBSN, what were some things that you thought about when you were trying to take a traditional media agency and bring them into that new platform? What were some things that you were thinking about, obstacles, and what were some successes that you had with that project?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing that with a lot of legacy media institutions as they, were trying to manage the transition to digital in the 21st century. That ultimately what you were doing is still important and frankly is probably the core revenue stream, but you need to find new ways to hit new audiences. CBSN was an example of, so CBS News for its first 60, 70 years had specific broadcasts, right? That you still recognize, 60 Minutes and the evening news and morning broadcast, etc. Ultimately had a website, but had not engaged in the 90s in the building a long-term cable news network. Like in 1996, within 3 months, you had the launch of MSNBC and Fox News Channel. CBS had some ideas around that around the 90s, but it never really took off. So you're looking in the mid 2010s now. Does it make sense to build a cable news network? Not necessarily, given where people are cord cutting. Let's focus on digital. So what you focus on internally is, okay, what platforms are we working towards? Where are the people? Well, there's a thing called Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire. Again, this was 2014. So you start to really see this kind of over-the-top streaming start to take off. But then in addition to that, Xbox is a platform that people, it turns out, look at news apps on. PlayStation, mobile phones, desktop. So let's get on all the new platforms. And now we have to build a 24-hour channel with our existing infrastructure. So the challenges are, each show kind of does its own thing. How do you create a situation where we're now operating on a 24/7 footing as opposed to a per show footing? How do we leverage existing talent, existing resources, existing coverage, plug in some new people, and start to be on 24/7, and start to build something that adapts to the audience? Because again, we'd never put a 24-hour channel on Roku before. How do people watch on Roku? How long do they watch for? When do they watch for? So acknowledging that once you've launched, you're pulling in all the great coverage that CBS does. You're adding breaking news to it. You're ensuring that it works on all these platforms. And then on top of that, you start to look at the data, which you have a wealth of data digitally, and seeing how people are interacting with the content, what they like, what they don't like, who the audience is, their age, their gender, etc., where they're coming from, and ensuring that you're giving them the news product that they deserve and they need and they're seeking. And it actually turns out, lo and behold, that a younger audience watches on these digital platforms, but assumptions about millennials that some had weren't true, which is, it actually turned out that they wanted much more coverage of international, and it brings us to this stuff, some of the things we're talking about, international coverage. They wanted ISIS coverage, etc. They didn't want to be pandered to in any way, shape, or form. And we heard that feedback immediately. And that's one of the great parts of digital too, is they'll let you know, they'll DM you on Twitter, they'll hit you on the app, and they'll tell you, I didn't appreciate that. I didn't like that. I come to CBS for X, Y, and Z. And so iterating once launched was key.
Right. It's funny because I think in the past few months have just been glued to your stories. And I wanted to touch on that a little bit, because if you're not aware, would you just start your Instagram this year, or was that something that you just started doing the curation of the news and your stories this year? How does that work? How did you start doing that, and where do you see that going for you in this year?
So one of the things that, so Instagram, I've had an Instagram account for about 7 or 8 years. I think we all started, between 2011, 2013, taking pictures of sunsets and food and whatnot. So I used it in that way, pictures of friends, pictures of family, etc. In that way. I never really used it as a news tool or intended to use it for an outside audience that wasn't, close friends and family. But March came around. Obviously, we started to all see the headlines left and right about coronavirus. And one thing that really frustrated me was the kind of rumor mill that was going around in mid-March about the U.S. undergoing military martial law, all the texts that we actually learned later, some of them emanated with the Chinese and Russians. to kind of sow chaos. So I was hearing about this stuff, and I was like, I gotta tell people that this is crazy, not to worry, and frankly, that perpetuating these sorts of rumors could lead to chaos in the grocery stores, on our highways. When people fear the unknown and fear martial law, which no one's ever, thankfully, in America had to deal with in recent memory, it could cause cause injuries or worse. So I took to Instagram, was like, guys, this is not the deal. I spoke to a couple of sources of mine who were formerly NYPD and Department of Homeland Security, and was like, this is how this works. Everyone just take a deep breath. This is what we know. And I got some positive feedback from folks. And so I started to curate some of the other headlines I was seeing, because people felt like there's a lot of noise out there. So started to take it on throughout the spring to start to kind of initially just focus on COVID related headlines, because there were so many coming at us, what I could verify, what I knew, and gradually, it turned into kind of a daily news feed. And I think there's something about Instagram stories, which is nice, which is it's chronological.
Right.
So as Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram have all turned to an algorithm where they prioritize stories they think you might like, or that your friends liked, or that been a conversation. At times, it's a political story on Facebook, which, people hate each other. Like, that's now risen because that's how the algorithm has treated it. Instagram stories allows you, this is what I know at 2:22. This is what I know at 3:30. This is what we've learned by 6:30. And you can kind of follow the story along as it goes. And so there's a limited screen room for text. So you try to really prioritize what's important. And ultimately, I've been focused on that the past few months as a project, just because I think we've reached the point on Instagram where it's more than just, sunsets and rainbows and influencers of the non-news and information type, especially as you saw the Black Lives Matter and the protests happen in the spring. People are now utilizing it to learn about issues, to advocate on behalf of issues. And from my vantage point, seek to prioritize fact-based stories to cut through all the noise.
And so how important is it with these platforms, like with Instagram, like you said, when the protests and the riots were happening, all of a sudden we saw that transition of factual information on Instagram. And as a journalist that is trying to find their place on these platforms, what kind of steps would you tell them to take in order to make sure that they're doing factual information or providing that for the public?
I mean, I think it's important if, you're going into journalism, you are trying to, some people are in advocacy journalism, right? They have a certain agenda they want to get across, or a certain issue they really want to push. I come at journalism trying to just get at the middle and get at the facts, report everything that we know and let folks who are consuming that content decide how they feel about it. I think what's important is you ensure that what you're putting forth under your name and your account is something that you would stand behind and is verified. There is a tendency on social media. I mean, frankly, sometimes we hear it from the president when he retweets something like, oh, I didn't know the deal with that. I just thought it was interesting. Okay, well, I would say that if you're in journalism, ultimately something you hold dear is your name and reputation. And so when somebody asks you, hey, you posted X, you should be able to say, yeah, I looked into that and I thought that was really interesting. That, there's a meaning behind it. And the other thing I would say is cover and report out what you think you're an expert at. If you really know a subject matter, then go with it. If you're passionate about it, go with it. If it's a stretch for you and you feel like, I don't really know what's going on here, then, maybe do your homework and do your research and, become that, what we talked about earlier. You've now become an epidemiologist, or at least know enough about it and done some interviews. And now you feel like, okay, I can go forth and tell that story.
So it looks like we have a question that just came in from Alan Alter. He wants to know, how many hours a day do you spend on curating the news on IG? Also, what's your take on Quibi, and will it, quote, make it in the world of new media?
All right. As far as Instagram is concerned, a couple hours a day, just kind of scattered throughout the day, ensuring I'm capturing, major headlines that are happening, interesting things that are going on. It really depends on the day of the week. You might notice I might do a little less on weekends than during the week, but So that's a couple hours. And I think, as we figure out how to grow that into a larger thing, or where there's an opportunity there for creation of news on Instagram, I might do more or less there. As far as Quibi is concerned, so full disclosure, I worked on a pilot for Condé Nast Entertainment for Quibi in the spring. And so got a vantage point into what they were doing. For those of you who aren't aware, it's the Jeffrey Katzenberg, Meg Whitman streaming startup that launched in early April. It's subscriber based now. It was free initially. You pay a certain number of dollars a month, and it was meant to be kind of a Netflix alternative for your phone, but all the content, Quibi is short for quick bites. All the content is between 6 and 10 minutes. So it's unscripted content, scripted shows, etc., but all very mobile oriented. And then given the realities of coronavirus, they now allow you to stream it to your television set. One of the unique characteristics of it is that we shot, everything is shot both vertically oriented and horizontally oriented. So when you hold it vertically in your phone, it's optimized for your vertical screen. It's not just the video flipped where you have those black boxes on top of each. So that was something that they really focused on. I think Snapchat does as well, which is how do we shoot and produce and edit content for your vertical screen so you don't have to turn it. I think that they put out a bunch of interesting content, a bunch of interesting shows, both in the news realm. There's everything from a daily NBC News show to BBC show, 60 Minutes in 6 minutes. And then there's a whole bunch of feature documentary, lifestyle content, and then scripted shows, and then reality shows like Chrissy Teigen as a judge. So there's a whole realm of content that's available. So to get around to Alan's question, I think that clearly from what I've read in the coverage so far, they've had some challenges getting the number of subscribers they would like aboard. It is very early on. They've only been afloat for less than 6 months. They did launch 3 weeks into coronavirus. As viewer habits were changing, I think that they have a bunch of new shows coming out in the fall. And at the end of the day, we all know this, like content is king. If you have a great show, great content, great concept, it'll work out. So I think it's too soon to say as to what may unfold there, but it's the technology is very cool. They have a lot of content there. The question is whether they'll get a sufficient number of viewers and subscribers to be able to really grow. But I know it's very early on for them, and they have a lot of content they plan later this year and early next year. So I'm looking forward to watching it with you.
It's interesting. I think the pandemic has made a lot of us kind of step back and think about what our next steps will be. And knowing that you've had your experience with Quibi and you're doing the amazing work you're doing on Instagram, what should a journalist be doing when it comes to trying out these new platforms? Is it really just kind of testing things out, or are there ones that you think are places that they should have a presence on no matter what? Like, what are some things that people should be thinking about as journalists where their presence should be on this platform?
Yeah, I think platform number one, if you're on no other platform but Twitter, it has its perils, it has its challenges, certainly frustrating at times, but ultimately that's kind of become, growing up in journalism initially, it was pre-Twitter, and the AP Wire and the Reuters Wire was your first line, right? And as Twitter developed in the late 08, 09, we started to use it. And then in basically in the past decade, Twitter has become that newsroom of kind of real-time news gathering. And so I would say that at least being conversant in Twitter, having an account there, following certain folks there, would be crucial. As far as other platforms, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to understand and learn about each platform as it happens. And by the way, not all those platforms last, right? Do you remember Meerkat? I had to learn that, and then it went away. And Periscope and Vine. And, I was told at one point at CBS, someone came out to me, they're like, if you don't have a Vine strategy, this whole thing's going under. I was like, okay. Well, so, all these things come up over time, and, what's the platform of the day right now? TikTok. So again, at least being conversant in it, having an account. As far as pushing out your content, you're going to reach different audiences on different platforms. Twitter is your platform where you're reaching a lot of other journalists and those news obsessed people. Facebook, you're reaching out to an older audience, but ultimately having a presence there is just as crucial, because it turns out that Facebook is the home of a lot of misleading and conspiratorial content sometimes, right? So you want to get out there, especially if you feel like you're doing great reporting, you want to push it out there. Well, Facebook also owns Instagram, and you can kind of push to both platforms. So there you are. And so ultimately, and Snapchat is really crucial in the kind of 15 to 25 demographic. TikTok similarly. So ultimately, I would argue, learn them all, figure them out, and depending on how many hours you have in the day, be on as many as possible.
It's funny. We always talk about what it's like for freelancers to pitch stories, but I'm curious to see, with your experience in the newsroom, if you're someone that's working in a legacy media agency, what are some tips you have, and if you have an innovative idea about pushing a presence for the legacy media to be on a specific platform or doing a specific story, what are your tips as to making sure that that's successful for them in doing that?
If you're already working within that organization?
Within the organization.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's a few things to keep in mind. One, if you're working at an organization, they have a business model, they have an audience, they have a main product. So you don't want to dismiss that, like, well, I know we work here and we do a magazine and a newspaper or a show, but like, we need to do something else. Well, no, there's simply a reason why it still exists in a certain way. And if it's a legacy media institution, it's been there a while, right? But ultimately, all of them have to adapt and change and try new things. So as long as you're there for a specific mission, a specific role. So do your job. Make sure you're doing a great job at it. If you have ideas, it's assessing politically who the right people, and when I say politically, internal politics, who the right people might be who are amenable or potential allies to that idea. Ensure that the idea is well thought out. Frankly, even if you're brainstorming, find that mentor to brainstorm, like, hey, have we ever thought of X? And they might tell you, yeah, we tried that 8 years ago before you were here and it was terrible, so don't bring that up again. Or that's really interesting, you should think that through. I think that might work with something else we're working on here. So figure out, identify your mentors, work through the idea. Once the idea is worked through editorially, think about it from a business perspective, because ultimately the organization will likely only pursue something based on the bottom line, right? Is there a potential revenue stream? Is there a potential benefit to the organization as far as prestige is concerned? There's a few different, or third bucket, is there a potential sponsorship or advertising or revenue stream there, which kind of brings you back to the first one. But ultimately, those are the ways that executives might think about a new vertical or a new idea. And so, think through the editorial, think through the business, identify your allies, and then pitch it effectively, because you might only have one shot at it. So make sure you're pitching it to the right people who are influential at that moment. And again, that's where mentors come in key, because it might turn out that you might have an ally somewhere, but that person has no influence with the people who might make it happen. So what I'm trying to say is, you can have the best idea ever, but if you don't think it through and you don't pitch it to the right people who have the right influence at that moment, it's not going to happen. So that's just a couple things to think about.
That seems almost like it's also, if you're a freelancer, that's something to think about as well, right? Or is there a different procedure when it comes to, as a freelancer, approaching like a producer for a legacy media, right?
It depends on what the idea is. If it's just a story idea that you want to cover, that's much simpler. If you're like, I think we should have a vertical devoted to X topic, that's a more complicated. If it's, I think we should have a product devoted to, like, that's a next level, right? So it's, again, ensuring that you're doing a great job, that you have a good reputation internally, and that you are talking to the right people at the right time who have the right influence to be able to, depending on how ambitious your project is.
Amazing. And so, considering we're an international community, I'd like to talk about your experience covering international topics for a national audience, right? What are some of the stories that you've worked on the past few years that you think is important for us to know about in thinking about your national audience, right? So right now, for example, we have just today the situation in Lebanon, correct? And thinking about what a newsroom can be going through right now, trying to cover the explosion in Lebanon. What are some experiences that you've had in the newsroom that you can share with us? when it's covering situations like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it really depends on the story and depends on the resources your organization has. I mean, you can view it from two completely different vantage points. There's the people on the ground, on the front lines, reporting things out, and the challenges they're going through to get through the facts, sometimes get to the story. I've often spent, more of the day dealing with the logistics of getting the reporter to the place, like trying to get to a terror attack in France on a day they're having a rail strike. And we're not even thinking about the editorial yet, because it's like, we need to get there to figure it out. So you have the folks on the ground who are sometimes putting themselves in pretty perilous situations to tell that story. And then there are the folks back at headquarters who are putting those stories together. And then there are the folks who are deciding, okay, depending on the platform, how much room we have for X story or how that fits into the show. And so there's multiple levels of decision making. And so, you could have a team on the ground that is finding those great characters, finding the people, first of all, getting the facts straight in a situation like Lebanon, where you have so many interests and so many potential sources of varying trustworthiness. It's just ensuring you're getting the basic numbers right and the facts right as to what happened. I mean, it began today with a firecracker factory and then became an admission that there's 2,500 tons of ammonium nitrate at the port of Beirut. And somewhere in between there were various conspiracies and theories related to Syria, Israel, Iran, the US, a whole variety of potential culprits, right? So just getting those right, ensuring then you're getting that stuff back to headquarters, ensuring the folks at headquarters understand the story, as well as the folks on the ground, because sometimes you're thrown in, one day you're doing the hurricane and the next day you're covering Lebanon, and ensuring those people are properly briefed and understand the context of the story. Especially when you bring up the Middle East, like the Middle East is a very complicated region with a lot of different viewpoints, and depending on who you ask, a lot of different facts. And so ultimately ensuring that you're fairly portraying it, the story, the extent possible. And so you're briefed up on that. And then as you're putting together the show, at the top of the tier, okay, I have 20 minutes on the evening news. Once you take out commercials, that typically gets me between 8 and 12 stories in the show. Some of those stories are as few as 20 seconds. Some of those stories are as long as 2.5, 3 minutes. So how much time do I have? Well, it's a hurricane coming up the East Coast, new pandemic stuff. The president said X in an interview. Lebanon is going on, and name 4 other stories that are happening. So where is that going in the mix? How am I prioritizing that? How am I telling that story to the nation? And obviously that's easier in a 1-hour cable show, a 2-hour cable show, or a 24/7 website or streaming service where you have a lot more time to address all those stories. So that's the last part of the equation.
So we had a question that just came in from Sean Gallitz. Sean, we would like to unmute you so you can ask him your question.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Nice. Well, Moshe and I go way back, but I had to come in and ask him. Him and I were talking about the recent poll and trust in media being tenuous at best. And I'm curious what Moshe thinks about whether that trust can be restored, or if we're kind of past the point of no return, given how many different places people can go and get the information that kind of already reaffirms what they believe and doesn't necessarily question their own assumptions.
Yeah, no, you're asking a complicated question that is vital to the future of our democracy, Sean. So I'm going to try my best and hope that we can all do better as journalists to improve that number. He, I think, is referring to a number that came out this morning, a Knight Foundation study of 20,000 Americans, and showed the highest numbers ever, nearly 4 out of 5, I believe, Americans who don't trust what they're hearing from mainstream media. So a few things, right? And it goes back to the old polling or the old message that, like, people hate Congress, but they love their congressman. People hate the media, but they love their source for the media. I hate the media, but I really love X as my news source. So I think, generally speaking, when you ask about the media, unfortunately, I think we're worse than Congress at this point.
Right.
the collective we. But when you say the media, what are you talking about? You're talking about the New York Times, you're talking about CNN, you're talking about the Financial Times, you're talking about Al Jazeera, you're talking about Breitbart, you're talking about Daily Beast, you're talking about, there's thousands of organizations, right? So ultimately, as far as trust is concerned, I think that there is something to be said. And again, I guess, it's kind of been reinforced to me through social media and Instagram recently about really having that dialogue with your viewers, and understanding the issues they care about, understanding the stories that they're talking about, and not just programming or publishing for America from a newsroom that is typically in New York or Washington, D.C., and reporters who, for the most part, might have gone to a 4-year private university in the East Coast or the West Coast, interned in those cities, and never really left them except to kind of jump to a story. And so that's why I think, getting that experience in local news and foreign news coverage, having that on-the-ground experience, understanding for how people react to things is vital. So I think, we've lost that trust to a certain extent because we're completely out of touch with the people who are consuming us. So they don't trust us because they're like, why are they saying that? Like, that's clearly not what's happening. I think there's also probably a divide, and I think we're still kind of tiptoeing around it, between the expectation that journalists have, which is, I tell you what the right hand did and what the left hand did, and then you figure it out. But when sometimes what the right hand is saying is not factual at all, or what the left hand is saying doesn't make any sense, but we report them as equal. So you'll see that, and I think there's been that realization over time when it comes to climate science, right? We used to give 50-50 split between the climate deniers and the climate change activists, and this person says X, this person says it's completely wrong. Back to you. Well, okay, what was the point of that? What was the point of that? So I think one of the things that the audience expects and will gain trust is I don't know, you went to Antarctica, you tell me what you're seeing out there. You guys, your job is to report out these stories and speak to these sources, and you have the unique ability to interview these leaders. You figure it out and tell me what's real, what's not. And by the way, leave your opinion out of it, unless of course I want your opinion, in which case I will tune into one of a handful of networks at a certain hour where I know I'll be getting an opinion. Yeah. So I think that's part of it, which is be real, call out the facts, report on issues that people are caring about, engage in a conversation. There was a really interesting experiment done a couple of years ago, and I'll end with this, by an ABC affiliate in Dallas, a reporter who would seek out, he basically used his viewers as an assignment desk. Hey, what do you guys care about? What questions do you have? And then he'd pick a question, and he would take that viewer with them to the story to answer that question. Yeah. So there's pulling down this wall where we're not sitting up there and declaring to you, this is the news today, and deal with it. But what do you care about? Oh, that's interesting. You know what? Let's go. And then what that reporter also told me was that the viewer was like, oh my God, you guys go to great lengths to figure out what the facts are. And I didn't realize how much time you spend vetting these stories and telling the story and ensuring there's balance and ensuring you're spending just as much time getting various voices in there. And so I think that also might engender trust, because people, assume now that the journalists just look it up or want it to happen, and so they tell you it happened. And by the way, it doesn't help that we have certain folks out there declaring fake news every day. But by the way, don't sit there and complain about that. Show, don't complain. Show what you do. Show that you're real news. And I think that'll start the, hopefully, Sean, the return to at least, 50% of people trusting us.
At some point, part of the issue right now, it's because our such an ease to access of spreading information, that speed of spreading information leads to maybe not taking the time to vet and do the things that are traditionally we would have done as journalists in the past. And do you know what I mean?
Yeah, but I mean, at the end of the day, I'll also, I'll play devil's advocate here. Journalists are under-resourced, underpaid. Newsrooms continue to get cut, and they're asked to do more days, more hours, right? So at the same time, I'm like, well, you really got to vet your stuff. And they're like, yeah, but my boss wants me to post 22 stories today. So that's really challenging. So, to the extent that it's possible, do it. But I don't underestimate the stresses and the challenges that journalists are, facing these days as newsrooms face a budget crunch.
So we have a question that's come in from Charles Gerber. Two-part question. So I'll give you the first one. What are your thoughts regarding the manner in which journalists have been spoken to in a hostile, degrading manner by certain elected officials in the US and non-elected government officials overseas, as well as being accused of falsifying news that is in fact accurate and true? That's the first part. I'll give you the second one after you're done.
The degrading manner by which elected officials in the US and non-elected overseas. So, I mean, listen, it's rough, right? It's challenging to already, have to go sometimes above and beyond to tell a story, to ensure that there's balance in there, to cut through governments or corporations that are trying to obfuscate or mislead. And so then on top of that, to have to deal with, the rhetorical wrath in some cases, or legal issues in some other cases, right? Whether it's the Philippines or Mexico or Russia or China or certain places where as a journalist, you can't report the truth if it doesn't jive with the government line. So it's rough, but it's also, part of what we sign up for, right? Is that ultimately, if you are going into journalism, part of what maybe you're looking to do is speak truth to power and get at the truth. And so that makes people uncomfortable. That makes people in powerful positions concerned. And so their first thing to do for many of them is to threaten you. And if that doesn't work privately, they will do that publicly. And so, it's upsetting, it's concerning. It's certainly something that, we took very seriously at news organizations I was at. The first thing you want to ensure is that your journalists are safe. And so you don't want them to take risks that will put themselves or their families in any sort of position of danger. At the same time, when there's no one to tell the story, the only story that will be told is the government line or the official line. And you want to be able to cut through that, especially in places in the world, and frankly now it's everywhere, where you might not be able to trust what the government is telling you. Or the government might be telling you what it believes and you will find out something else. I mean, you saw the case domestically here with PPE in the spring, which is the government's like, yeah, the hospitals have everything they need. And then, certain people in hospitals are wearing garbage bags. And they're like, no, we don't have enough. And, that took both kind of individual journalists, but also national organizations to be like, this is what's happening in American hospitals and, in the first world and the richest country in the world. And so that's important. So, it's frustrating and it's certainly concerning to me as a journalist that you now see certain lines about fake news being repeated by Bolsonaro in Brazil, and you see it happening in the Middle East, and you see it happening in China, and you see it happening here in the US. And that's concerning. And the hope is that, ultimately, especially here in the US, we're very lucky. The journalism is the only job enshrined in the Constitution or in the First Amendment.
Right.
And so that's huge. No other job, no other profession is mentioned in the Bill of Rights. So that's something we shouldn't take for granted, but also understand with that comes great responsibility and sometimes a whole wrath of, nasty comments.
And I think the part two of his question was, do you believe these acts by certain elected officials in the US and occurrences overseas are some of the causes for the lack of trust of journalists?
Certainly. I mean, I think you can see a trajectory, especially since you saw a partisan divide in the US numbers, that Republicans don't trust the media Republicans trust the media 3 times less than Democrats do. I think that's no coincidence, given what you hear from the president, that you see that divide along partisan lines there. But also what was really concerning in those numbers is that 18 to 35-year-olds had the least amount of trust in the media. It was the young people who didn't trust the media. And so, I think they see their world kind of all these changes happening, and they didn't get the feeling that the media was sufficiently covering that, or at least wasn't creating those expectations there. So I don't think it's a coincidence. It's frustrating, and there's only a certain amount you can control as a journalist, which is what you report every day and what you do.
In the pandemic right now, I feel like for the first few months, we're in this push to constantly cover the pandemic. Do you think there's some topics, some things that we're probably missing, maybe on a global level, because of our main focus being on coronavirus coverage?
I mean, I'm certain of it, right? Like, at the end of the day, I often think about it like programming a newscast. You know, when I was programming evening news, it was 20 minutes. And so every decision we made often, you know, means that of what was in the show means something else is not in the show, right? Which means 350 million Americans are not seeing it on their television set over the air, available with an antenna still, right? And so, yeah, I mean, it's certainly concerning. And I think that you see some coverage of it online, you know, in terms of how certain governments and leaders and corporations are taking advantage of the fact that our attention is all applied to pandemics and or the pandemic, and things that would typically have been covered or scrutinized by journalists are not being covered. And frankly, just given travel issues and the fact that people can't move around mean that you can't get eyes on certain things. So that's certainly concerning. It's certainly concerning for one of the stories that I think we need to really drill in on, and I wish there was more coverage of it, is the Chinese treatment of the Uyghur Muslims, right? You saw on BBC interview a few weeks ago of the Chinese ambassador being interviewed and questioned about pictures of people being loaded into train cars. I mean, very concerning, and frankly, you know, reminiscent of images from the European Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust. And so, is that getting proper coverage? No. Well, it also turns out it's really hard to report in China. And they just kicked out a bunch of Western news organizations. And on top of that, any organization that might investigate or infiltrate it might be really just dealing with covering the pandemic. And so that's just one example of a story that I think would be getting more coverage and more scrutiny right now without a global pandemic happening.
And so what's your take right now? We're in election year right now. I know you've done that in the past. And what's your take on what's happening so far and what we can expect, you know, past Labor Day? I think that's after Labor Day, we can really focus on, you know, I'd like to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple trend lines to be aware of, which is one, this is an election like no other, right? Because it all basically went into pause in mid-March. And so the primary effectively stopped, Biden had a lead, you know, effectively clinched it. You're going to have a digital convention for both parties effectively in Milwaukee and in Charlotte. But what does it matter? Most people will be on Zoom anyway. That typically was a huge event. I mean, if you go back in the history of American politics, the convention was typically where the candidate was decided. Only in the past 50 years have we really kind of built up this primary system and known the candidate prior to the convention. So the convention has really become a made-for-TV event over the course of the last 20, 30 years. And it's a huge promotional tool because you're getting 3 hours of free air on television. And so the campaigns typically used to assume they'll get anywhere between a 5 or 10% polling bump from the convention. I was on the campaign trail as a reporter covering the McCain campaign in 2008. And following the Sarah Palin speech in their Republican convention, he took a lead over Obama. That lasted several weeks, actually. Now, another typical assumption is you will have heard the adage that Americans don't pay attention until after Labor Day.
Right.
And so anything that happens before Labor Day is just noise, and then it's the 2-month sprint to Election Day. Well, people are now going to be early voting in certain states the first week of September. I think North Carolina is the first week of September, which means based on where the polling is at that point, whether you're paying attention or not, people will be voting starting the first week of September in certain states, and that'll grow throughout. So whatever you get on Election Day or whatever the polls stand on Election Day, tens of millions of Americans will have already cast their ballot prior to Election Day. So, you know, another previous assumption in the previous world is October surprises, major events that happened in October. 2016, you had a few, right? You had James Comey announcing a reinvestigation into Hillary, then 10 days later saying there's nothing there. You had the Access Hollywood tape come out. In 2000, you had revelation that George W. Bush had been in a drunk driving accident. And so, or had a DUI arrest. And so those would change the dynamic. You also have 3 debates in the fall. Those would change the dynamic. So something to be aware of is that however things feel or look in November, 2 months of voting will have taken place. You won't have seen the typical campaign you would have previously seen. One other thing that's a signifier of how candidates are doing is the rally crowds. How many people are showing up to see Trump? How many people are showing up to see Biden? In previous cases, you saw like tens of thousands showing up for Obama and a couple thousand showing up for McCain. Well, something's going on there, right? And then in 2016, huge crowds for Donald Trump, not so much for Hillary Clinton. Something's happening there. So that barometer is also not going to be available to us to get a better assessment. So if you don't already believe any predictions, don't believe any of the predictions. Try to look at some of the state-by-state polling. To the extent that political scientists out there can start to determine how many people are voting and when, it's going to be a really hard job for folks in the decision rooms on election night, where you would typically learn, we're going to make X network is calling X state for this candidate, is going to be nearly impossible in certain cases, unless it's a blowout in certain places to make. So I think the president was right when he told Axios yesterday that we might be looking at weeks or months before we know who the winner is.
Right. So we have a question. What was your reaction to the GOP banning journalists from its convention?
So I have to admit that I don't know the exact details of that, because I know that they're allowing coverage of certain things and not allowing coverage on the floor. Is that person able to, I got to be honest with you, I'm not totally well read in on what the final RNC policy is there.
Well, just in general, I feel like maybe it can even touch on an international level, right? So we had Bolsonaro even in Brazil, where he was, restricting journalists from having access to certain things. And then I think journalists were boycotting or protesting against that. I think on the global level, we're seeing the restriction to access for journalists in a sense.
Yeah, it speaks to Charles's earlier question about, the rhetoric that's aimed at journalists these days. It's not just rhetoric, right? It's decisions to block off coverage. We saw it as early as the beginning of the Trump administration. Secretaries of state typically allow journalists to travel with them to every country they go to.
Yeah.
Rex Tillerson, who was his first Secretary of State, decided no, I'm going to just show up places and not take reporters with me and not tell you where I'm going to be. And so not giving access to journalists in turn hurts what the average voter and citizen knows about what's happening with their government in their country. So I don't know that we've done a good enough job, or politicians who oppose that have done a good enough job explaining the ramifications of that to folks, that ultimately you have a journalist there for verification of what happens. Third-party verification that what politician X said happened actually happened. And that you're actually getting accurate pictures. There's a bunch of news organizations, including ones I worked for, that have policies of not running official government photos.
Right.
Because we need our photographer there to ensure we're accurately capturing the event, because we can't trust the government official necessarily to always ensure that everything that is newsworthy is within the frame, right? So that's...
Or they're pushing an agenda of some sort, right?
Correct. This, we saw it with protests, everything. If you take a picture of this angle, it tells you one story. If you take a picture of the next angle, it might tell you a completely different story. And depending on what agenda or what goal you have, you can push that agenda. So I think that as far as restricting access, to me, and the expression goes, sunshine is the best disinfectant. And it's very important that, and we're finding that out in more ways than one with the pandemic, I guess, but both when it comes to journalism, allowing full access is important. And I think you found certain politicians have also found sometimes that when they allow journalists more access, they might actually get more positive coverage. It was made famous by John McCain on the campaign trail. And actually Pete Buttigieg did this on the campaign trail this past winter and spring, where he basically was like, you're on the bus with me, ask me anything. Yeah. And frankly, the president ascribed to that in a certain way as well. So any limited access, I think, hurts journalism, but more important, hurts our democracy.
Right. I think it's important for people to understand the importance of press freedom. I think as journalists, we understand it, but spreading that message to the general public and the audience around the world, I think that's something that it's something that's important for us to do, especially in this day and age. What is your perspective on that, Noah, about press freedom? You're seeing the limited access of press freedom around the world we're seeing right now.
Yeah, listen, I agree with you 10,000%. Ultimately, anywhere where you can have a smart, educated journalist who, is reporting things accurately for folks, is important, and so I think that the more we showcase the great work that we do, and leave our personal opinions out of it, obviously call out the facts and call out the falsehoods, but the more we can showcase that and hopefully explain to the audience why we're covering what we're covering, how we're covering what we're covering. I'm all about bringing down that fourth wall. And I think we talked about it a little bit earlier, that ultimately, if we explain a little bit about our process sometimes, which can seem really difficult to understand, or people just have no idea, I think that helps a lot. And so people appreciate what it means to have the media there and journalism there, especially as we get pointed to and told we're fake news. And so, again, without making the story too much about ourselves, it shouldn't be about ourselves, it's about the story. I think that's a concern and complaint I hear from people, like, you guys only care about yourselves and you talk about yourselves all the time. So finding that proper balance, I think, is important. Figuring out what platform to use to tell, to reinforce what we're doing, how we're doing, why we did what we did, is really important.
Right. I think I remember reading a recent study that came out about the effects of covering stories like we've seen these past few months on journalists, and how important it is for us to think about taking care of ourselves, in a sense. So I'm curious, because you come from that background, being 24/7 news, always being on the ball, and then now you're curating on Instagram news that just kind of like takes time. And I'm curious to see, what are you doing to take care of yourself, and what steps are you taking? What kind of tips would you give to others that may be struggling to do that?
I'm going to try my best, but I think that if you ask my family and friends, they would tell you he still needs to work at it, finding that balance. Yeah, I mean, we're people too, right? And the stories we cover are difficult, and sometimes stories really hit home. It was never lost on me that when one of the worst stories, most difficult stories to cover are those mass shootings, right? Innocent people taken from you inexplicably by someone, sometimes without really a clear agenda, right? Why did this happen? Unexplainable. And what you have to do in television, there are people, booking producers, who have to go out there and speak to the family about speaking on camera about someone they lost, sometimes within hours of losing them. That is an incredibly difficult task. I mean, I don't discount the difficulty of losing a family member, but then also having to go in and knock on that door and be like, hey, are you game to talk about, what that person meant, or what happened, or what you witnessed, the tragedy that you just witnessed, is incredibly difficult. And that also goes for, covering the war in Syria and living on the floor of a cement floor in a destroyed building to tell that story. And you're committed to telling that story. You're in this because you care passionately about giving people the news and giving to them straight, and you will stop at nothing to tell that story. And sometimes one of the fortunate things of being behind or being in a management role is one of your duties is to ensure the mental wellness of the people around you. They can't do a good job if they're not well, both physically, obviously, but mentally. And sometimes, one of my bosses, when I was early on and running all times of day and never sleeping, was like enforcing a vacation upon me. And I was like, what's a vacation? And they're like, you will stop covering the news as of 5 p.m. on Friday, and you're taking a week off. And I was very young and upset by it. And only after the fact realized, like, thank you. Like, I didn't realize that, like, I needed sleep, that I needed a break, that I needed to talk to my family, that I needed to read a book, that, whatever it is that your hobby, whatever, play an instrument, whatever it is that you need to do to just take a break from what is really upsetting, are upsetting things to cover. That we're not, we're human too. And so I would advise both managers out there to keep their finger literally and figuratively on the pulse of the people who are working for them. And by the way, it's even more challenging now via Zoom, right? You're not seeing them in the newsroom, like something's up. You're catching them via Zoom, but like, to what extent can you do check-ins one-on-one with folks to ensure they're okay? And sometimes the hard and fast among us will say, we're fine. And it's incumbent upon you to tell them, no, you need a break. And also upon us to like take a second and look around and know that the news, as we know, continues every day, and new things pop up. And it may seem like a really big deal to take a break from something, but you'll be better for it. Your family will be better for it, and your readers and viewers will be better for it if you just take a pause once in a while.
Wonderful. I know we just hit the 1 hour mark, but I want to make sure if anyone has any questions to me, please get those in within the next few minutes. So what would you consider as the most memorable part of your career? Is there a highlight of your career that stands out for you? Is that something that you think about?
Not really. I mean, I know it's a fun question to ask, and I'll shoot it back to you. Like, what's your favorite story you ever covered?
Something that stays with you, you know, like something that you always remember that sticks with you as a journalist?
Yeah, I mean, there are certain stories where like are seared in your mind, right? And so I think that, you know, one of the things that always comes to mind is flying into Tokyo day after the Sendai earthquake, as Fukushima, the nuclear reactor, started to melt down, and covering that story for several weeks. Just well, first of all, the fact that you're going through 7.0 plus aftershocks and living through that, but watching another country, another nation go through complete uncertainty and living in fear of the unknown, right? Watching a city of one of the largest cities in the world, Tokyo, watch hourly radiation readings and wonder, like, do we need to evacuate? Well, only grandparents and children. And knowing that what they told you yesterday is not necessarily true today, and might not be true or might be true again tomorrow, and then not the next day. And frankly, it reminds me, one of the reasons it comes up is it reminds me a lot of the current situation. It was kind of a preview of the pandemic, because you have a certain trust in your government, but even the government hasn't quite gone through something like that before and doesn't quite know what's happening. One of the things watching that was quite memorable there was watching the society deal with it in such a empathetic way, sympathy towards each other, empathy towards each other, calm, watching tens of thousands of people line up to take trains out of Tokyo, completely calm, no one cutting the line, as you know, they're getting radiation evacuation warnings, and imagining what Grand Central Station or Penn Station might look like in a similar circumstance. So that was, you know, really kind of a unique thing to watch. And frankly, you know, I think that, you know, really personally for me, like having to cover and watch the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, you know, as a Jew who grew up going to synagogue and knowing that as a kind of a place of refuge and hope and good feelings, covering that as a journalist and watching a tragedy kind of unfold in a place that has meaning to you personally is always difficult. So, you know, that's a story that was really challenging, and, you know, you want to cover effectively, but find that that's where we speak to your last question, that like sometimes you're not okay. Sometimes it's really hard. And it might be a story that you have a close connection to, or a story, frankly, where you're just talking to people who've lost everything, or who are going through a really difficult circumstance, and knowing that, you know, you're another person for them to talk to. You're not a journalist holding a microphone in their face necessarily, but you're talking to them, and you might be the first person they're talking to about X, and knowing that you're a human and they're a human, and that's the first thing to know. And so I think those are the moments, you know, those really difficult, unprecedented feeling type moments, scary moments that kind of really sear in your imagination.
So what can we expect from you? Besides your amazing Instagram story feeds, is there anything in the slate for what we can expect from you this year?
Well, it's one of the things I'm working on is working with a number of organizations on their digital media strategies. So I mentioned earlier, having worked at CBS on that, worked on a Quibi project this year. So I'm very interested in the next thing, and helping to build new ways in new organizations that will help tell great stories, and also helping existing organizations pivot to those new platforms. So that's something I work on independently. As far as Instagram is concerned, it's one of those things, like I told you, started because I was really annoyed about a headline I saw. it turns out it serves a need. It meets a need for certain folks on a platform that hasn't really seen that. So, you know, I think that, sorry?
More so than you imagine, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I was like, is this such a big deal? I take some headlines and I like, you know, some memes and, you know, some pictures and throw it out there. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's like, you're trying to, and it's something I tried to do as a programmer in television too, is you're trying to give people a balanced diet of everything they need to know, everything they want to know, and maybe a little inspiration, maybe a little hope. And so I think that that the world is not all bad. People are not all bad. There are good people out there doing good things, and they should be highlighted too. Because our tendency in the media is always to focus on, oh wow, that was terrible.
Right.
We need to cover that. But I mean, for good reason. That's a whole separate conversation. But I think that Instagram will continue to grow. I look forward to your feedback at Mosheh, my first name, on that front, and then we'll grow from there, and I'll work with other organizations. And you know, any of you, I'm happy. Anyone who views this platform and thinks I can help or advise or mentor in some way, I'm happy to chat.
Wonderful. And is there anything else you'd like to add before we end our conversation?
No, I enjoyed this conversation. I think the story in Lebanon reinforces the important work that international foreign reporters are doing around the globe. You have a lot of fans here in the U.S. You have incredible platforms available to you now to get your story out if official, national, or big organizations are not telling them. And people are desperately seeking truth and facts. And so keep doing great work, and you know, ideally we'll overcome this period of time where journalism, you know, faces both verbal threats and unfortunately legal threats in a number of countries.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Before we end our conversation, I wanted to remind you all about the rest of our talks that are taking place the rest of this month. Next week, we'll have our rescheduled date with Sanford J. Unger. He is the current director of the Free Speech Project at Georgetown University. He also served as the 24th Voice of America director, having served from 1999 to 2001. With everything that's happening with Voice of America in these past few weeks, we're really looking forward to getting his insight on the matter. On the 18th, we're going to have Ghada Weiss, who is the principal anchor and presenter for Al Jazeera Arabic. She previously worked for a number of Lebanese newspapers, television channels, and radio stations, and she spent more than 2 decades in broadcast journalism. In a recent Washington Post op-ed in July, she discusses the online social media attacks against her, and we look forward to digging deeper with her about the state of journalism for women, and especially during this age of cyber attacks. The 25th, we are actually really excited to team up with the freelance journalism community of SPJ, with the executive director and president of the Freelancers Union, Rafael Espinal. With everything that's going on with the pandemic and freelance journalism, we're really looking forward to digging deeper with them as well. And we will send more information for you guys to register at the end of the week in our email. And I want to thank you, our guest today, Mosheh, for joining us. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you, Al. It was great.
And thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you next week. Take care and be safe, everyone.